The sound comes first, not sight, but sound. A horn blast, foreign and harsh, cutting through the grey dawn of Northumberland. It is June 793, and the morning bell of Lindisfarne Monastery has not yet rung for prime. Cuthfleda is 17 years old. She stands in the cold stone dormitory, her bare feet on the packed earth floor, when the screaming begins outside. The other girls, there are 6 of them sharing this room, freeze mid-movement. Their linen undershirts cling to their thin bodies. Some are still pulling on their woolen kirtles. One girl, Wulfhild, who is only 14, has dropped her veil entirely and stands staring toward the narrow window. Through that window, Cuthfleda sees them. Shapes. A dozen men at least, perhaps more, moving with a purpose that has nothing to do with prayer. Their beards are wild, their arms are bare despite the cold, tattooed with symbols that make no sense to her. They carry axes. The weapons catch the light, real, reflecting the dawn sky as if to prove this is happening. Cuthfleda's mother had placed her in the monastery when she was 6 years old. 22 years of safety, of routine, of knowing exactly where every stone was in the great cloister. The scriptorium where she spent her afternoons copying Latin psalms. The refectory where Sister Ethel served thick barley pottage. The chapel where she sang the office in her high, thin voice that Sister Margaret said was like an angel's. These were the boundaries of her world, and they had felt absolute. Now, as the sound of running footsteps echoes through the corridors, and men's voices, guttural, angry, speaking a language like the grinding of rocks, those boundaries dissolve. A door is kicked open somewhere below. Wood splinters. Someone is praying aloud, their voice breaking on the Latin words. A younger girl, perhaps 12, begins to whimper. Cuthfleda finds herself reaching for Wulfhild's hand, both of them moving toward the corner of the room as if cornerness itself could protect them. The monastery had been founded 150 years before her birth. Stone upon stone, bell upon bell, prayer upon prayer. The nuns had believed they lived in a fortress not just of architecture, but of faith. The world outside was pagan, yes, but also distant. Word came occasionally of conflicts in the Scottish lands to the north, of tension with the kingdom of Mercia to the south, but Lindisfarne was holy ground. The raiders would not dare. But they are daring now. Cuthfleda hears the screams of the older women, Mother Superior's voice high and commanding, then suddenly cut short. The crash of the great oak doors to the main building, the shattering of glass that should not shatter in a sacred place, and then silence. Not the silence of prayer, but the silence of held breath, of waiting for horror to announce itself. Someone knocks on their dormitory door, not a knock, a blow. The wood frame shudders. Wulfhild's hand in Cuthfleda's becomes damp, trembling. Cuthfleda can feel her own heart in her throat, taste copper on her tongue. She is trying to remember the prayers for protection, for peace, but her mind fills instead with small, useless details. The color of the light falling across the stone floor, the smell of lavender from the dried sachet Sister Ethel had placed in the linen chest, the exact shape of a crack in the opposite wall that she has stared at 1,000 mornings during meditation. The door opens. A man stands in the frame. He is broad, with red gold hair darkened by sweat. His eyes are pale. He stares at them, at 7 young women in various states of religious dress, and something shifts in his expression. Not mercy, something else. Something that contains intention, purpose, and a kind of terrible clarity. This is not a random violence. This moment, Cuthfleda's moment, standing in the corner with Wulfhild's hand in hers, watching a stranger's eyes move across her and the others, is the first step of something far larger, far older, and far more organized than anyone in that dormitory would have believed possible. This moment is where a specific girl becomes simply one more body in a system. This is where her name begins to matter less than her value, and her value is about to be measured in a way she cannot yet imagine. The raid on Lindisfarne Monastery on June 8, 793, happened. It was documented. Cuthfleda may be a composite figure, but the women she represents were real. The chronicle writers who would record this event in the years that followed called it a sign of the apocalypse, the arrival of demons, divine punishment for sin. But beneath their apocalyptic language lay something far more mundane, an organized military operation, planned, executed, and profited from. The primary sources are scattered but consistent. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the raid in stark terms. Terrible portents appeared over Northumbria and miserably frightened the wretched inhabitants. These were exceptional flashes of lightning, huge whirlwinds, and fiery dragons flying in the air, a sign of change followed by a great famine, and afterwards by the arrival of fierce pagans who laid waste to the country. The language is apocalyptic, yes, but it is also testimony. Something happened. Someone wrote it down. The monastery records themselves, fragmentary, preserved in later copies, mention not just the destruction, but the abduction. A letter from Alcuin of York, one of the most educated men in the Christian world at that time, speaks of the attack and mentions specifically that captives were taken. He does not list their names. He does not describe what happened to them, but he acknowledges their absence. In the margins of later manuscripts, monks added their own notes, brief, often anguished. The sisters were taken. Pray for those carried away. These fragments, these silences, are also evidence. The Norse sagas, composed centuries later but based on older oral traditions, provide another layer of information. They are not objective. They glorify the raiders, their violence, their seizure of wealth and women. But in that glorification, they reveal truth about purpose. The raids were not random. They were systematic. Ships were built for speed, designed to carry cargo and captives. The raiders had knowledge. Which monasteries were wealthy, which routes were fastest, which seasons made escape from sea attackers impossible. Scouts had traveled before, plans had been made. The archaeological record supports this. Lindisfarne itself, excavated and studied for centuries, shows evidence of focused destruction. Buildings deliberately burned, not random fire. Treasure chambers specifically targeted. Living quarters methodically searched. The pattern matches what we see in other monastic raids across northern Europe over the next 70 years, at Jarrow, at Iona, at Wearmouth. It was not chaos, it was industry. And then there are the slave records, the fragmentary evidence of where captive women ended up. A slave sale document from Dublin, dated to the early 9th century, mentions young women described as from the northern churches. Trade routes connected Scandinavian ports to markets in Ireland, in Francia, in the Mediterranean. Court records, ransoming letters, property inventories, all of them include women of religious status, taken young, valued specifically for their youth and their previous unavailability. This was not myth. This was business. This was system. And when historians piece together these sources, chronicles, archaeological evidence, legal records, linguistic traces and place names, the degraded but persistent memory embedded in saga and poem, what emerges is a dark picture. The capture of monastery women was not a side effect of Viking raids. It was, at least in part, the point. The women taken from Lindisfarne, from Whitby, from Iona. They disappear from history almost completely after their seizure. But that silence is not emptiness. It is the sound of a system that consumed them, that erased them, that rendered their experiences so routine to the people in power that almost nothing was recorded. To understand Cuthfleda's fate, and the fate of thousands like her, we must listen to that silence and then speak into it, because the people who lived through it were denied the chance to speak at all. To understand why monastery women specifically became targets, we must understand what a monastery represented to a Viking raider in the late 8th century. A monastery was not merely a religious institution, it was wealth made visible. Gold altar vessels, silver reliquaries, illuminated manuscripts bound in leather and precious metals. Books themselves were status objects, each one representing months of labor, of knowledge, of value. A monastery was also, crucially, defenseless. The rule of Saint Benedict forbade monks and nuns from bearing weapons. They were supposed to meet violence with prayer. But beyond treasure, there was something else. Prestige. A young Viking warrior could return home having plundered a holy place, a place his enemies held sacred, a place protected by divine law rather than military force. To seize its resources, to desecrate its altar, to carry off its most precious inhabitants, was to demonstrate power not just over bodies or gold, but over the very idea of sanctity. It was psychological warfare. It was saying to Christian kingdoms, your God cannot protect what you believe is most sacred. The women, in particular, serve multiple functions in this system. First, as commodities. A young woman of proven virginity, of education, of noble or religious status, could fetch high prices in slave markets from Dublin to Constantinople. A monastery woman had something even more valuable: rarity. She had been kept sequestered her entire life, trained, her body unmarked by childbearing, her mind shaped by years of discipline. She represented a kind of human property that ordinary warfare could not easily produce. Second, they served as hostages and bargaining tools. A wealthy monastery or a Christian king would pay ransoms to recover holy women, sometimes at enormous cost. The English ecclesiastical chronicles record ransoming attempts throughout the 9th century. A bishop paying in silver to recover sisters. A king sending envoys to negotiate the return of nuns from a Danish encampment. The system worked because Christian morality demanded that the church value the recovery of its own. The raiders understood this perfectly. Third, and most deliberately, the seizure of monastery women served to demoralize the Christian world. If holy women, women who had dedicated their lives to God, who lived in prayer and poverty and virginity, could be taken and violated with impunity, then what was the power of Christianity itself? What did it mean to have faith in a God who could not keep his own nuns safe? This was not accidental. Raider leaders understood the psychology. They were not trying to conquer Christianity through military force alone. They were trying to prove it powerless. The evidence for this comes from the patterns themselves. Monasteries were chosen with precision. Small, vulnerable communities were targeted repeatedly. Heavily defended fortifications were generally avoided. Multiple raids hit the same locations over decades. Not because they were wealthy, but because they were known to house women. The Frankish monasteries of the Seine Valley, the Irish monastery chain from Clonmacnoise to Skellig Michael, the English houses along the Northumbrian coast, all of them saw repeated assaults specifically aimed at the female community. In Scandinavian society at this time, women had certain rights and powers within the household economy. But the systematic capture of Christian nuns represented something new: organized procurement of enslaved women on an industrial scale. The Norse had a word, thrall, that encompassed slave status. But a religious woman, once taken, fell into a particularly degraded category. She was simultaneously valuable and utterly vulnerable. She had nowhere to go. She had no claim on kinship, no legal recourse. She belonged to whoever had seized her. This was the system Cuthfleda entered when that red-haired man stepped into her dormitory. It was not improvised cruelty. It was the application of an understood principle, that certain women, in certain places, could be taken and transformed into property, with the full expectation that they would be sold, moved, used, and that no power in the Christian world could effectively stop it or recover them. 3 days after the raid, Cuthfleda wakes to the sound of someone else's whip. She is no longer at Lindisfarne. The ship that carried her and the other women across the North Sea was small, crowded, reeking of fish and bilge and human sweat. The journey lasted 4 days. 2 girls were sick nearly the entire time. One, Mildred, who had been the monastery's finest singer, did not speak during the voyage, and still has not spoken since. Now she is in a settlement she cannot name, in a land she does not recognize, in a wooden longhouse shared with 17 other people, and an ancient Swedish woman named Gunhildr, who seems to be in charge. Gunhildr is not young, her face is creased, her hair iron gray. She speaks the Norse tongue fluently, and, more importantly, she speaks Latin. She had been a slave herself, taken from a monastery in Francia 40 years ago, and never left. Now she oversees the other captive women. She is their translator, their guard, and their teacher in the unwritten rules of survival. The dormitory where Cuthfleda sleeps is a partitioned corner of the longhouse, separated from the main area by a hanging woolen cloth. 6 women share this space now: Cuthfleda, Wulfhild, Mildred, a woman named Elfgith from Whitby who is older and more hardened, a girl called Godrun who speaks almost no English, and another whose name no one remembers anymore because she was renamed almost immediately. Gunhildr calls her Kara, which means wild. The day begins before dawn. Gunhildr enters and pulls the cloth aside. She carries a wooden stick, nothing elaborate, just a tool, and she uses it to strike the sleeping platform where the women are tangled in their thin blankets. Rise, rise. The day is waiting. Her voice is matter of fact. The women move. There is no groaning, no resistance, because resistance has a cost that everyone here understands. They are given a thin gruel of millet and water, sometimes with a piece of dried fish. No ale, only water from the well. No bread as Cuthfleda once knew it, thick and dark and made from the monastery's grain stores. The meals are designed to sustain them, not nourish them, to keep them alive and obedient, but deliberately underfed. A woman who is slightly hungry is less likely to be desperate enough to flee. Their clothes have been taken from them. No more veils, no more kirtles that speak of religious status. Instead, they wear simple linen shifts, undyed, shapeless, and rough woolen dresses that are too large or too small, whatever was at hand. Gunhildr inspected each of them the first day. She looked at their hands, their teeth, their skin. She ran her fingers across Cuthfleda's back as if assessing livestock. "You were not a servant there," she said. It was not a question. "Your hands are soft. You know letters. This is useful." Then she had left. The labor is constant. The women are worked in different ways depending on their utility. Elfgith, who is strong-backed and who had worked in the monastery kitchens, is sent to help with the heavy tasks of food preparation. Godrun, who is younger and quieter, is put to textile work, preparing flax, spinning, weaving. Mildred and Wulfhild are kept for other purposes. They are kept closer to the main hall. Cuthfleda is given a role that terrifies her more than any labor would. She is to teach the household children Latin and to help Gunhildr with record-keeping. She writes, now, not psalms, but the inventory of the household. How many furs, how many bolts of cloth, how many captive women. There is no privacy. A woman cannot relieve herself without permission and without being accompanied by another. usually Gunhildr or an older slave. There is no place to be alone. The dormitory has no doors. The workspaces are all communal. The household operates on constant observation, not from cruelty, but from calculation. An escape attempt is always possible. A woman who thinks she might be missed, who is watched too closely, is less likely to try. The women are not supposed to speak to each other unnecessarily, and they are absolutely forbidden from speaking their own language in the hearing of the household. When Wulfhild spoke English to Cuthfleda after the first week, Gunhildr heard and beat her across the knuckles with a wooden rod until she cried. "Norse," Gunhildr said. "You learn Norse. English is behind you. You forget your mother's tongue, you begin to forget your mother. This is mercy, not cruelty. The faster you forget who you were, the faster the pain stops." Wulfhild did not cry after that, but her hands shook for hours. At night, when the work is done and they are locked in the dormitory, locked, yes, with a wooden beam across the door, sometimes Cuthfleda hears singing. It is Mildred, singing wordlessly, a melody that sounds like no hymn Cuthfleda ever learned. The sound is so quiet that only those in the compartment can hear it, and Gunhildr seems not to mind it. Perhaps she remembers singing herself 40 years ago. Perhaps she lets it continue because she knows what happens to a woman's mind when every small thing that makes her herself is taken away. Perhaps that low, anguished singing is the only sign that Mildred has not entirely disappeared. On the 7th night after they arrived, Elfgith did not come to the dormitory. Gunhildr said nothing about where she was. The next morning, Elfgith returned, her face blank, her movements slower. She would not look at the other women. When Cuthfleda tried to speak to her, Elfgith turned away. Something had happened, something that Elfgith could not name and that Cuthfleda understood she should not ask about. This was the system working, the knowledge that certain things happened in the darkness to certain women in ways that no one would speak about afterward. The knowledge itself was punishment enough. The fear of it kept the rest compliant. This was a life now, the life Cuthfleda would live as long as she was useful, or until something changed. Wake, work, eat thin food, move only when told. Learn a language that erased the one she had spoken since childhood. Wear clothes that did not belong to her. Sleep in a room with the same women, all of them trapped in a silence that was part of the punishment. The monastery had also been a kind of confinement, but it had been a confinement she had chosen, or at least one her family had chosen for her in childhood, and she had grown into it, and it had felt like safety. This confinement was different. This was confinement with the constant underlying knowledge that the person doing the confining saw her not as a sister in Christ, but as a possession whose value was measured, and, if she became less valuable, could be spent. In the Norse worldview, a captive woman from a Christian monastery occupied a particular symbolic space. She was, in the eyes of her captors, a thing that had been consecrated to another god and then seized. The desecration of that consecration held meaning. It was not hidden the way slavery might be in other systems. It was formalized. It was given ritual shape. Beginning in her 2nd month of captivity, Cuthfleda was brought to the main feasting hall when men gathered. This happened in the evenings, when the household had finished its labor and the warriors, or merchants, or raiding party members who were passing through, sat drinking and eating. She was told to stand at the far end of the hall and sing. Gunhildr had taught her a Norse song, a folk melody with simple words. She was to perform this for the men, and she was to smile while she did it. When she first refused, the punishment was swift. She was struck across the face hard enough to draw blood from her lip. When she was brought back to the dormitory that night, she sang it without hesitation. The singing was humiliation, yes, but it was also something more calculated. It was a display of ownership. A warrior could sit among his peers and gesture to the captive woman and say, with no words needed, "She is mine. She was taken from a sacred place. She now performs for my entertainment." This was the public face of the system. The private face was far worse. After perhaps 6 weeks, Cuthfleda was taken from the dormitory one evening by a man she did not know, a visitor to the household, a traitor from the south. Gunhildr delivered her to him, made a brief transaction with him about silver, and walked away. The man did not take her somewhere private in the normal sense. He took her to a storage shed adjacent to the main house. In that cold space, in the dark, she was raped. The word itself is a kind of mercy compared to what it was. It was the fulfillment of what the capture system was designed to produce. The complete violation of a woman whom the law, if she had still had access to law, would have been sworn to protect. It happened with the full knowledge of everyone in the household. It happened because she was property, and property can be used. Cuthfleda did not speak about it. Neither did the other women when it happened to them, which it did, in varying ways and frequencies. Mildred was taken less often, perhaps because she was quieter, or more broken, or because the men seemed to understand that she would not survive much more. Godrun was taken frequently, and each time she returned even quieter than before. Wulfhild, mercifully, was not, perhaps because she was seen as too young even by the standards of a slaveholding society. The system was not uniform. It was tailored to what each woman could endure, calibrated to keep her alive and within the household. But there was more. Twice a year, at seasonal turning points, the household gathered for a kind of ritual feast. A girl, sometimes a captive, sometimes a thrall born into slavery, was ceremonially married to one of the household leaders or to a visiting warrior of status. This was not marriage in any meaningful sense. It was formalized rape, blessed by the household, treated as a binding arrangement. The girl would wear a wreath of white flowers. Cuthfleda recognized them as ironic mockery, the symbol of her former monastery's innocence transformed into theater, and would be led to the bed of the man she was bound to for the night. The household would chant. There would be laughter. The next morning she would return to her dormitory and her labor, and the marriage would be over. In the winter of her second year, it was Cuthfleda's turn. She knew, weeks before it happened, that it would come. The household's patterns had become clear to her. She had also begun to understand something else, that she was, in some measure, fated to this, that escape was not really possible, that the only thing she could control was the internal landscape of her own mind, and that even that was being systematically dismantled. On the night of the ritual, as they were preparing her, as they were binding the white flowers into her hair, she did something that had accumulated in her as a kind of slow rebellion. She refused to weep. The men were waiting for tears, for pleading, for the performance of feminine despair. She gave them nothing. She walked to the marriage bed expressionless, unmoved, absent from her own body if she could manage it. Her silence was a form of resistance, not resistance that changed anything, but resistance that preserved something, some small core of her that she would not give them. The next morning, Gunhildr found her in the dormitory and, without a word, beat her with the wooden rod, harder than before, across the back and shoulders. Not until Cuthfleda cried and begged her to stop. The message was clear. Resistance of any kind, even internal resistance, would be punished. The system allowed for the possibility of a woman's body. It did not allow for the possibility of her mind remaining her own. There was one moment of open resistance that marked Cuthfleda's third year. A ship arrived, carrying not just goods, but other captive women. 5 new girls, all from monasteries in what was now Danish territory. Among them was Hilda, who had been educated in a scriptorium and who spoke multiple languages. Hilda refused to learn Norse. She refused to sing. When ordered to work, she moved deliberately slowly. When ordered to eat, she did. She was methodical in her insubordination. On the 8th day, Gunhildr announced that Hilda would be sold. She was being taken to Dublin, to a slave market, where she would be auctioned to the highest bidder. Before she left, she found a moment in the dormitory, just seconds, to press something into Cuthfleda's hand. A small piece of wood. On it, carved with what must have taken her hours and tremendous risk, was a cross. Just a simple cross, no larger than a thumbnail. It was an act of profound defiance, a refusal to forget Christ, carved in a place where religion was forbidden. Hilda looked at Cuthfleda and said, one sentence, in English, "Remember, there was before." Then she was gone. Cuthfleda kept the wooden cross hidden in her mouth at night, keeping it on her tongue, tasting the wood grain. It did nothing to change her circumstances. It did nothing to free her. But it was a reminder that she had not always been here, that she had been something else, that the system's goal of complete erasure had not entirely succeeded. The system was nearly total, but not entirely, not quite. By the time Cuthfleda had been captive for 3 years, the raids on monasteries had not stopped. They had become routine. The rhythm was predictable. Spring and early summer brought raiding parties. Autumn brought trade expeditions selling the captives taken in spring. Winter was a time of consolidation, of slave ownership and labor. The cycle repeated. By 810, just 17 years after Lindisfarne, monasteries across northern Europe had begun to fortify themselves, building walls, training their male inhabitants in combat. The system had forced a response. In the monasteries themselves, there was a different response: silence. The institutional church had to reckon with the captured women in a way that public records do not always acknowledge. The women had taken vows, they had belonged to Christ, and then they had been taken, violated, and sold. To admit this fully would be to admit that the church could not protect its own, that its vows meant nothing against the violence of the world, that women in its care were ultimately disposable. The silence around their fate was not accidental. It was protective of the church's reputation, not of the women. Some ransoming attempts did occur. A letter from King Aethelred of Northumbria, dated 806, requests that a bishop negotiate for the release of certain holy women held in captivity among the Northmen. He does not name them. He does not specify how many. The bishop is authorized to pay reasonable compensation. But what constitutes reasonable compensation for a human being? The amounts paid are fragmentary in the records. Sometimes they appear in terms of silver or cattle. One ransom, mentioned in a chronicle note, was paid in amber and furs, which is to say, in the very commodities the raiders valued. The church paid in the currency of the world it claimed to despise. And the ransomed women faced another indignity. They could not simply return to their former positions. A woman who had been taken, who had been violated in captivity, was no longer considered suitable for monastic life in many communities. She was marked as defiled, as having lost her virginity, never mind that she had lost it against her will. Some communities accepted returnees, but others did not. A rescued nun faced the possibility of lifelong shame within the very institution that had failed to protect her. For some, return to the monastery was a kind of second captivity, not violent, but suffocating in its judgment. Laws began to be enacted in response to the crisis. In 844, the Council of Orleans passed canons addressing the sexual violation of women, but the canons were remarkably narrow. They focused on the violation of nuns specifically, and only in the sense that it was an offense against the monastery and the church, not against the woman herself. The law recognized the rape, but conceptualized it as a property crime, a theft from the religious institution. Some secular kingdoms in the 9th century passed laws imposing harsh penalties for purchasing or selling women taken from religious communities. The penalty for buying a monastery woman as a slave was sometimes death, sometimes mutilation. But enforcement was another matter entirely. How would a kingdom enforce such a law against wealthy traders operating in foreign ports? How would they police the slave markets of Dublin or Constantinople? The bitter truth is that the legal reforms, when they came, protected the institution far more than they protected the women. A monastery had legal recourse if its property was stolen. A captive nun did not. The laws about ransoming were often so expensive that most families could not pay them. A woman taken in a raid was simply assumed to be gone, lost to this world and, the church sometimes suggested, perhaps destined to sanctity in the next one. A grim consolation that transformed suffering into spiritual opportunity. By the early 10th century, the raids had evolved into something different. The raiders themselves were settling, establishing kingdoms. The slave trade continued, but it was now integrated into stable economies rather than episodic raiding. This meant, paradoxically, that the system became more entrenched. A raider could be convinced to cease his raids if military pressure was applied. But a settled society built on slave labor was far harder to dismantle. The women who had been taken in the first waves of raids were no longer being ransomed because there was no longer the expectation that anyone would pay for them. They had become permanent fixtures in a new social order. They had disappeared not in death, but in incorporation. Their silence had become not temporary, but permanent. The church, meanwhile, had made a tacit peace with the situation. Monasteries continued to exist, the raids continued to happen at diminished frequency, and the women who had been taken were almost entirely written out of history. Not from official cover-up, but from a deeper kind of erasure. They had no names in the records, no voices, no agency. They existed in the documentary record as absences, as the blank spaces in monastery rolls where names had been removed. This was not chaos. It was policy. The systematic capture and enslavement of monastery women was not an aberration. It was rationalized, bureaucratized, and woven into the economic fabric of Norse society. It persisted because it worked. It ended not from moral conviction, but from changing circumstances. Power created the system. Only shifting power dissolved it. The deeper truth is this: civilization is measured by how it treats those with no power to resist. Cuthfleda and the thousands of women like her had no army. They had no law that applied to them. They had vows that meant nothing in the hands of people who saw those vows not as sacred, but as evidence of vulnerability. The system was not designed by monsters. It was designed by people who understood perfectly what they were doing. It was professional. It was effective. Lindisfarne still stands. You can walk its stones today. The guidebooks tell you about the raid of 793. They do not tell you about the women who were taken. The dormitory where Cuthfleda slept still has its walls. The stones remember nothing of her. At Whitby, at Iona, at every monastery along the northern coasts, the same silence persists. Beautiful ruins, erased inhabitants. We preserve the stones and forget the people who lived and died within them. When you stand in these places, you are standing in a crime scene. You are walking over the lives of women who have been so thoroughly removed from history that their absence barely registers. Ask yourself, what are we looking at when we admire these ruins? Are we admiring achievement or complicity? Can we separate the two? How many systems exist in our own time that operate with the same logic? Hidden in plain sight, normalized, profitable, dependent on the erasure of those who have no power. How many women disappear, not into death, but into invisibility, their stories simplified or erased entirely, their voices recorded as silence? These are not rhetorical questions. We do not know what happened to Cuthfleda. We do not know if she survived, how long she lived, or if she ever saw England again. We know only that she was taken, that a system was built to transform her from a person into a thing, that we have spent more than 1,000 years forgetting her, not by accident, but by design. But there is one thing that cannot be erased, the fact that she existed, that she was real, that at some moment in her life, another woman, Hilda, carved a tiny cross and pressed it into her hand as an act of defiance. A cross so small it could fit in a mouth. A cross that said, "You were something before this. You are something now." If you believe these stories should not disappear, if you believe the women who were silenced deserve to be named even in their namelessness, then subscribe, share this, speak these names: Cuthfleda, Hilda, Wulfhild, Mildred, even though we can add nothing more to them, because forgetting them is the system's final victory. And we are not ready to give the system that victory. Not yet.